Hello, my name is Lauren Leverins, and today I'll be discussing the topic of open source. Throughout this presentation, I will be discussing what is open source software, differences from other softwares, importance to non-programmers, benefits, disadvantages, and the top companies that use open source. According to opensource.com, the term open source refers to something people can modify and share because its design is publicly accessible. Open source projects, products, or initiatives embrace and celebrate principles of open exchange, collaborative participation, rapid prototyping, transparency, and community-oriented development. Open source is an emerging concept that has gained popularity in recent years, most likely because of its free of charge. There is also software called open source software, or OSS, that provides a computer software ability to practice open source, and the definition provided in the last slide. Open source software refers to software that is developed, tested, or improved through public collaboration and distributed with the idea that it must be shared with others, ensuring an open future collaboration. This is very commonly seen in classrooms, linking students and teachers. Now, how is OSS different from other softwares? The main takeaway is that open source license affects that many people can use, study, modify, and distribute software. Generally, open source licenses grant computer users permission to use open source software for any purpose they wish. This being said, OSS encourages collaboration among programmers to use, study, modify, and distribute that software just as they have done. Now, it may be a popular belief that computer programmers or software engineers only use open source, but that is in fact false. Because early inventors built much of the internet itself on open source technology, like the Linux operating system and the Apache web server application, anyone who is an internet user benefits from open source software. People rely on remote computers when performing tasks they might otherwise perform on their local devices. For example, they might use online word processing, email management, and imaging editing software that they don't install and run on their personal computers. Instead, they simply access these programs on remote computers by using a web browser or mobile phone application. This is using open source software. Some people may call this cloud computing because it involves activities like storing files, sharing photos, or watching videos, but it depends on what application one is using. If you're using Google Docs, then that is in fact cloud computing, but other applications such as OwnCloud and Nextcloud are open source. Cloud computing usually runs on top of another software such as open source software that helps them operate smoothly and efficiently. According to opensource.com, there are two major benefits for using open source software. They have defined them as training and security. Those two benefits are the two that I will be defining and delving into. Many people prefer open source software because it helps them become better programmers. Open source is public software, which gives students the ability to study and self-teach in order to make better software. Students have the ability to correct, connect, and collaborate with others due to open source sharing abilities. This software gives students a one-up when pursuing a software degree. The next is security. Security is generally an advantage or disadvantage to all the topics that we have studied thus far, but thankfully, people prefer open source software because they believe that it is more secure. Because so many programmers can work on a piece of open source software without asking for permission from other authors, they can fix, update, and upgrade open source software more quickly than they can any other software. There are not many disadvantages to open source software because it's pretty efficient, but a setback does come about because of the lack of ease of use. Open source operating systems like Linux cannot be learned in a day. They require effort and possibly training on the side before you are able to master them. It's an advantage for people who train to get better at it, but it is very difficult for beginners to grasp. A company that is a very strong user of open source is LinkedIn. You may not use LinkedIn, but if you've ever visited Wikipedia, Tumblr, Twitter, or done anything while using the Mozilla Firefox browser, you've benefited from LinkedIn's code. LinkedIn engineers developed and continue to steward the Apache Kafka messaging program, which just so happens to apply to a lot of services outside of itself. And since it's free and open source, companies like Twitter, Tumblr, Netflix, and Pinterest use Apache Kafka too. Matt Asay recently named Facebook the largest open source company of all. Facebook is built on open source from top to bottom and could not exist without it, wrote software engineer Jordan DeLong when the company released open source library. That's probably why Facebook has given back so widely with a variety of open source tools. What takes Facebook above the average contributor is that it's the only company to have open sourced an entire data center. OpenCommute is an enormous project that makes every component of your average data center totally transparent, from power systems to servers. Facebook is also one of the companies that have been contributing to the open source the longest. The company has been talking about the importance of its open source ethos since December 2006. To conclude, there are many ways to benefit from using open source. During this presentation, I have discussed open source software, its relationship to other softwares, its ability to be used by non-programmers, its relationship to cloud computing, the benefits of open source such as training and security, the disadvantage, and finally the impact that it has made through and with other companies.